Hi, my quilting friends. My name is Leah Day, and welcome back to the Friendship Quilt Along. Today I am quilting this beautiful scrap overload block with ruler foot quilting. Because this block is so scrappy, there's really no point in going totally over the top with a crazy quilting design. Instead, I'm going to use one ruler, the slice quilting ruler, to stitch straight lines, working around this beautiful diamond medallion in the center and along the borders. So let's jump on the machine and learn how to do some ruler foot quilting together. So I'm here on my Eversewn Sparrow 20, and to get started ruler foot quilting, I have attached a ruler foot, and this is a specialty foot with a high base that allows you to press templates or rulers right up against them. It's really important to use a ruler foot specifically because otherwise a regular darning foot can easily have the ruler slip underneath or above it. So you want to make sure to get a ruler foot for your machine. As far as settings, I have my machine set to a 0-1 stitch. That's a center straight stitch with the needle in the middle position. And then I'm going to lower my stitch length to 0. What this does is it completely stops the feed dogs from moving. They'll bounce up and down, but they're not going to actually feed your quilt forward. I don't drop my feed dogs because I find that often messes with the tension on my machine. And my machine, just in case you're wondering, is the Eversewn Sparrow 20. You can learn more about it at leahday.com/sew20. Okay, another thing I have on my machine is a queen size Supreme slider. That's a big Teflon sheet, and that's going to help this block glide and slide really smoothly. And just in case you're wondering, ruler foot quilting and free motion quilting are kind of basically the same thing. The only difference is here I'm using the ruler foot that has a high base, so I can use the rulers too. But I can wiggle off and do something like stippling if I wanted to, because this is just a different form of free motion quilting. Now, one thing I'm checking as I push this foot around is if it's easy to move the block around, and I'm feeling a little bit too much resistance here as I push the block over, the foot over these seams, these areas of real bulky seam allowance. So what I'm doing here, I loosened the foot slightly. And let me just take off the foot here. I want you to see just how much room you have to adjust. You can see the side of this foot, and you can find this foot in the deluxe foot set at leahday.com, and you can see just how much room you have to adjust. It's not designed to stick the screw right in at the top. That would probably drop the foot down way too low. So you have lots of room to adjust here depending on how thick your quilt is. So I'm going to pop it here on. I'm going to drop the foot down, make sure that the foot is in the down position. And then I'm going to just get this screwed in place and try and lower it so that way the foot is just skimming the quilt surface. And I do it this way so that way the foot doesn't get hung up whenever I am stitching over those bulky seams. So just gotten the foot kind of finger tight. And then that feels like a pretty good height to me. I'm going to tighten that up and then test it again. There we go. And I use a screwdriver to tighten that up. And so you can see how I can move the entire block smoothly, even over those areas of bulky seam allowance. It's not getting hung up. Now you also need to be careful not to have the foot rest too high. That can sometimes lead to skipped stitches and thread breaks. So if you get things set up and then suddenly something goes wrong and you're breaking thread all the time, that might mean your foot is too high. And this is definitely one of those feeling kind of things. You just got to get in there and get started and experiment with it and see what works best and then adjust accordingly. There's not really a set right way to do it or a set perfect position for your foot. It really does have to adjust for every quilt every time. Okay, I've got my hand on the hand wheel over here, and I'm going to drop my needle into the down position, bring it all the way back up, tug on that top thread that brings up a loop. That's your bobbin thread. Have both of those thread tails in, tuck them underneath the foot. And that just makes sure that the bobbin thread isn't going to make a mess on the back of your quilt, and it helps you get started on the right track. Now, if you do that and you just cannot seem to tug up that bobbin thread, what that means is that you just haven't made a full rotation with your needle, and you need to rotate your hand wheel a little bit further. Okay, so my plan here is to stitch around these diamond shapes, and I'm just going to echo ditch. And echo ditching means stitching a 1/4 inch away from those seam lines. So I'm just going to get started, pushing that quilt forward. And what's nice is I have so many seam lines because of all these half square triangles that I can pretty much always have seams where I'm going to stop and reposition. And while this is free motion quilting and I don't have to rotate with every single line that I stitch, I probably will, just because I'm in the center of a very large block, and that's what feels most comfortable for me. But just in case that's something that you're worried about, here you go. I have the ruler here to the back. I'm pressing the edge of that ruler along that seam line. This is awkward, but I can definitely do it. So yes, you can quilt in all different directions. It just might feel really awkward. Now the thing to keep in mind here is that the block will not move if you don't push it. So if I take my hands off of this and I'm not pushing it, as you can see, I'm just stitching in place. So the alternative, if you don't have a ruler foot, then an alternative would be to use walking foot quilting. And that's a totally different form of quilting, and I have many other videos on it. And in that case, the quilt will be being fed through the machine, and the machine and the feed dogs and that walking foot will help to guide it and create the perfectly spaced stitches. Because that's the other thing. As I push, I'm trying to keep my speed relatively consistent as the combination of my speed and my hand movement pushing the quilt through is what creates the stitches. Okay, this is working out pretty good. I really like this so far. I like the look of that gray thread going on the edges of all of those pieces. I think that's going to look nice. Now, the slice ruler that I'm using here has lots of edged lines. So if you feel like echo ditching is kind of, just not really what you have in mind, well, you can always go in and stitch straight lines 1/2 inch apart, 1/2 inch away from the ditch, 3/4 inch away from the ditch. It's entirely up to you. So use those lines on a ruler to help you space out the lines that you're quilting on your quilt. Here we go. And as you can see, it doesn't take very much time to just stop and reposition things, but again, it might save just a minute or a few, I should say, it'll save a few seconds to leave the quilt in place. But I don't know, I kind of feel so awkward whenever I stitch sideways like that, that I just wonder if, what I'm saving in time of repositioning, I'm losing in, not so perfect stitches because it doesn't really feel all that good. It feels very awkward. You can hear that I run the machine fairly quickly. The motor is running loud, but I'm moving my hands at a slow, steady rate. Now I did see I just took a fairly big stitch, and on my machine I can back up 1 stitch just by lifting that needle and rotating the hand wheel backwards. And there we go. I fixed that. That looks much better now. Okay, this is another kind of awkward angle, but let me show you that yes, you can stitch along it. And I get a lot of questions. This is a good point to point something out. I get a lot of questions about ruler thickness. On a low shank machine like this Eversone Sparrow 20, you want to use the thinner rulers. And there's a reason for that. Back here on the back of the foot where it attaches, there's a very long bar that comes down. Well, if I push, I can get the ruler underneath that bar, and then I can stitch at that angle coming in that direction. So something a lot of quilters find confusing is the proper thickness of ruler to use with your machine. For a whole machine that has a low shank foot, such as my Eversone Sparrow 20, you want to use low shank rulers, which are these thinner rulers that are about 1/8 of an inch thick, about the same thickness as your cutting rulers for cutting out pieces of fabric. And the reason is, back here, you've got a very long bar that comes down that connects to your foot. Well, with the thinner ruler, you can actually tuck this back there and get the ruler underneath that bar and be able to stitch in that direction with the ruler behind the foot. If you had the thicker ruler, this wouldn't work. You wouldn't be able to put it back there. It would hit that bar. Now, there are other machines, high shank machines, and of course long arms as well. They're going to use thicker rulers because that foot attachment is very different and it doesn't come down so far. So you can use the thicker rulers on those types of machines. And if you're not sure what type of machine you have and this is confusing for you, don't worry. Just send us an email. We can tell you what type of foot that you'll need and what thickness of ruler. And some machines can honestly go either way. Some machines can use either thickness of ruler. They're a high shank machine that could go with thin or thick. But you really just want to look at, well, hey, what might change? You might change to a long arm. Well, in that case, a thicker ruler might be wise. But it's one of those things that I think a lot of machine manufacturers have made a little confusing. And, it's one of those tricky things about ruler foot quilting that is not a lot of fun. But once you figure out what works on your machine, you pretty much have it figured out. And then you have a foot and rulers that fit nicely. Okay, so this is going really quick and I am really liking this design. And just in case you're wondering, this is as much quilting as this quilt needs. So you can see there is a really nice diamond that I have just echo ditched. Now, if I wanted to, I could go inside and echo ditch around that square too, if I, really wanted to. But my batting has a rating, and that rating is quilting up to 8 inches. And that means, or I think it might be actually quilting up to 10 inches, which is huge. So that means basically I can leave this whole section empty without any quilting in it. Doesn't need any quilting to be stable and to hold the layers together. It's going to still wear nicely and the batting's not going to shift in the middle of that space because I've already secured it enough. So it's really a design thing. If you think it will look better to do a little echo ditching inside each square, definitely do that. If you think that's going to stitch it up a notch, then by all means. I think this is looking great just the way it is. I like this effect, and I think it's going to be really fun to do something similar in our border. So I'm going to continue stitching all the way around just this exact same way, just lining up my ruler with that ditch line. And whenever I have imperfect piecing, I'm not worried about that. I just kind of line it up down here and I line it up there, get it roughly straight, and then I push it through. And I just don't really worry about it when the piecing is slightly off. The quilting really is just there to accent that, and it doesn't really matter. So I'll meet you back here when we're ready to start ruler quilting in the border. That's going to be coming up next. So I have worked my way around those outer half square triangles, doing more echo ditching. So just like before, I've got the edge of my ruler lined up with the seam lines. Those are the ditches on your quilt. And I just rotate it around, line up the edge of the foot, the edge of the ruler with that seam line, and then I also push the ruler foot right up against the ruler too. This is the thing about ruler foot quilting. You have to make sure that the ruler and the foot are always in contact, and you're not wiggling away from the ruler. Otherwise, it's really easy to stitch off in any direction. And so whenever I'm thinking about this, whenever I'm doing ruler foot quilting, I'm always pressing the ruler hard up against the foot, and then I'm also pressing firmly down on the quilt. And you can see here on my slide ruler, this is actually my slice ruler, I have all of these true grips placed on the back, and this helps it grip the quilt. You don't want it to be slipping and sliding around. You really want it to grip firmly, and then that acts as, like an extra grip on the quilt and helps you guide it smoothly through the machine. I also wear quilting gloves just so I can get a really good grip of the quilt too, and that helps it stop it from like slipping and sliding right underneath my fingertips. You want to have good control. Good control allows you to be able to steer the quilt well, especially when you're not stitching straight lines. When you're doing all kinds of wiggles and loops and stuff, you really want to have good control for that. And then it also, I find, helps you focus in on those stitches and not, really get in too much of a hurry and just shove the quilt through the machine, which results in some really big chunky stitches that don't look all that great. So it's pretty slow and steady, but as you can see, it's not a race, and you will get it done quite quickly. I think I've only been working on this for about 15 minutes, So really, this is a very simple, very speedy quilting design, and it'll take you about the same length of time if you use a walking foot too, because you can see just how much I'm rotating things around, shifting it so that I'm always facing forward. And that's just simply so I produce the best stitches I can. Okay, so there we go. I matched up with my starting line. Here's what you do whenever you end a line of quilting. I bring my needle all the way up to the top, and then I'm going to pull the quilt away a short distance, about 5 to 6 inches, and then I'm going to clip those thread tails and leave them nice and long. And the reason I do that is so I can tie off and bury these thread tails. So I give that top thread a tug, it's just a gentle tug, and I pick at, there's like a little loop that pulls up. I pick at that loop, bring that up, that's your bobbin thread. Then I just tie those 2 thread tails in a knot, simple overhand knot, and then I bury that knot in the batting layer, in the middle layer of my quilt, using a cheater needle or self-threading needle. And I have a very detailed step-by-step tutorial on how to do this. Check it out, leahday.com/hide threads. You can find it there. And I go in a lot more detail and go a lot slower too. You can see just how fast I've gotten with that, even with wearing gloves. And the reason that I do it that way and tie off and bury every single thread tail is because it looks great on the front, it looks great on the back, it secures the thread properly so it's not going to unravel, and it also doesn't leave a nasty knot or a glob of thread on the surface or back of the quilt. I really don't like that. It's very unsightly, and I find that oftentimes that glob of thread method really doesn't work. The threads come unraveled eventually, so that's no fun. Okay, so now I want to space out and I want to leave a good 3/4 of an inch between this line I just stitched around and the next line I quilt in this border. And I can do this spacing with this slice ruler. So what I'm going to do is line up the second etched line from the edge with the line of stitching I've just done. I'm going to line that up, and then I'm going to look for the seam line that runs down between those 2 black background pieces, because that seam line is the midpoint between that in that triangle. See that triangle? That seam line that runs right down the middle, that's the midpoint. So if I line up 2 things, if I line up that line etched on the ruler and I put my needle down in that seam line, then I know I'm in the right spot. So there we go. Make sure, shift that over just a bit. That looks good. And practically in the ditch of that scrappy border already, and that's great. This is going to really fill quickly and easily. Now, one thing that is very important to point out, if you lift your foot, like let's say something happens, you break your thread, you lift up your foot, just make sure that that foot is always in the down position every single time you drop your needle, because this foot has such a high base. If you have it in the up position and the needle goes all the way down, you can see that it will hit, the needle bar on your machine will hit the top of that foot. This is one of the things that makes ruler feet a little bit tricky. So you make sure the foot is always, always, always in the down position before you hit the gas, before you start stitching, before you drop the needle down, because otherwise it will break your machine. Okay, so we got started, and I'm just lining up that line, basically the line that's etched furthest to the inside, 2 from the edge, and now I'm just stitching on down, and it looks like it's just about perfect spacing that I don't even have to really look for that seam line. I just need to stitch to the seam between the border and the center block, and that's going to be perfect. So here I'm stitching out, and then I'll go all the way across the corner. There we go, lining that up, and straight on down. So very, very, very simple quilting. And again, you can do this with regular free motion quilting or with walking foot quilting. Now with regular free motion quilting, it's a little bit trickier because you have a harder time getting things to line up and be, especially perfectly straight lines. That's hard to do with regular free motion quilting. So the key there would be to mark the lines with a block this busy though. That's going to be a tricky thing to do because there's just so many fabrics and it's so scrappy. So my best advice for that would be to mark the quilt with tape, and that way you can really see those lines clearly And then all you have to do is basically exactly what I'm doing, minus the ruler, stitch along those lines slowly and carefully. I would change direction just simply because it will help you be able to see what you're doing and make sure that that line stays nice and straight. And notice that the index finger of my right hand always stays parallel with that line. That helps it stay nice and straight too. So lots of fun tips here, very, very simple quilting. I hope you enjoy quilting block number 5 with me. So that's it for this video. I hope you learned a lot about ruler foot quilting and you're excited about giving it a try. I love the look of this block both on the front and the back. It's very simple, and if you're worried about this being a little too open in these sections, well, you can always add a little bit of quilting. Echo ditch around these squares that are in the corners. And you could also do some echo ditching inside these diamonds as well if you want to add a little bit more stitching to it. You could also do that stitching with your walking foot, with free motion quilting, or by hand. So definitely mix it up and have fun finishing your scrap overload block. Now, if you'd like to find the pattern for this crazy scrappy block, come and find it at leahday.com/friendship. That's where you can find all of the quilt patterns I've shared so far, along with all of the quilting tutorials and videos as well. And don't worry if you're getting started late. All of the tutorials are going to stay online forever, so you will always be able to catch up and work at your own pace anytime. So come and join in the fun at leahday.com/friendship. Until next time, let's go quilt.